What if I told you that the story of Moses could reveal exactly what's missing in your life? Within this journey lie answers capable of transforming your challenges, your worldview, and even your destiny. The truth is that this story is much deeper than what Hollywood has shown. Many movies have distorted the details, creating a version that simply doesn't exist in the Bible. Now, here's something that almost no one notices. The book of Exodus mentions a pharaoh who defied Moses and refused to free the Israelites, yet it never reveals his name. Think about it. How can such an important character have his identity left unmentioned? Is it just a coincidence, or is there a hidden meaning behind it? Before we continue, I need your full attention. If you ignore this, you might miss the answer you've been waiting for, because this revelation could be exactly what God wants you to hear today. Moses wasn't born a leader. He was born a target. Death surrounded him from his very first breath, and his fate seemed sealed. But against all odds, he survived. Rescued from the waters by Egyptian royalty itself, Moses grew up in the luxury of the empire he would one day challenge. He didn't wield swords, lead armies, or need armor. He faced the greatest empire of his time armed only with a staff and a divine promise. Now, pay attention. Moses was never officially an Egyptian prince. He grew up in the palace, was treated as part of the royalty, and had access to the education and luxury of the court. But the Bible never says he was given the title of prince. His identity was always in conflict. He wore Egyptian clothes, yet his blood was Hebrew. He lived among kings, but his people were slaves. And that's where the true journey begins. Now, you are about to discover the powerful secrets of one of the greatest leaders in history. Perhaps you'll realize that his journey could also be yours. I've seen many people ignore this message, but those who listened saw their lives change in ways they never imagined. Moses' journey was not an easy one. He had to overcome fear, doubt, and, above all, himself. The call to purpose rarely comes subtly. It hits like a shock, demolishing everything that holds you back from growing. It's a moment that changes everything, and for Moses, that moment arrived when he witnessed injustice unfolding before his eyes. In an impulsive act of anger, he killed a man. And in a single instant, everything crumbled: his identity, his position, his life. The Hebrew raised as an Egyptian was now a condemned fugitive. He traded royal silk for the dust of the desert, far from Egypt and everything he once knew. But that's how the greatest journeys begin. Not with glory, but with a fall. Moses didn't yet know that his true mission was only just beginning. Now, stop and think. Isn't it precisely in moments of difficulty that the truth is revealed, showing us who we really are? Moses experienced this firsthand. He was raised by the Pharaoh's daughter, educated and treated as part of Egyptian royalty. And for a while, he may have even identified with that position. But the Bible makes it clear, he knew his true origin. Here's the big lesson. Sometimes, we need to lose everything to find our true purpose. Many live without direction, trapped by the idea that they are only what others see. Or worse, what they believe themselves to be. But the truth is, we are called to something greater, and when we realize that, the identity that once limited us must die. This transformation comes at a price. It demands ruptures. The places that once made sense begin to feel empty. Some people no longer walk in the same direction, and what once defined us no longer serves us. Now, stop and reflect on your own life. How many times have you felt like you were living an identity that wasn't truly yours? How many times have fear, doubt, and circumstances tried to define who you are? The truth is, all of us, at some point, become prisoners of a version of ourselves that no longer represents who we truly are. And that's exactly what happened to Moses. He had to confront the truth about himself, and that changed his story forever. Moses' life seemed all set. He had fled Egypt, escaped his past, and found a new home in Midian. There, he was just a shepherd, living a simple life alongside his wife and new family. Moses wasn't just far from his problems. He was also distant from the call. Moses spent 40 years in the desert before he was called to free Israel. 4 decades of waiting with no signs, no answers, no direction. But here's the big question. Were those years simply wasted? Or was he, unknowingly, being prepared for something much greater? At some point, have you ever felt that your life was at a standstill? But what if your desert isn't an end, but training? The time between the call and fulfilling your purpose can be long, and that wait can be painful. But in reality, God's silence is never abandonment. It's a time of building. Often, we judge God's timing based on our own limited perspective, thinking the opportunity has passed or that we've been left behind. But God sees far beyond what we can perceive. During that time, Moses might have felt forgotten, but in reality, he was being trained. Every day tending the sheep in the desert was preparing him to lead an entire people through that same desert. What appears to be lost time may actually be strategic. God uses the obscurity to forge character, strengthen faith, and teach us to depend on Him. And when the call arrives, He finds us ready, even if we don't feel that way ourselves. Perhaps you, too, are waiting. But remember, the time of waiting isn't wasted time. It's the preparation for the moment when everything will make sense. The question is, when that day comes, will you be ready? And then, God called him, Moses, Moses. God's call often doesn't come the way we imagine. It comes in a form we simply cannot ignore. For Moses, it was the burning bush, a fire that burned without consuming, something extraordinary in the midst of the ordinary. How many times do we wait for a grand sign or a spectacular moment when, in reality, God is already speaking? It might be a door opening, a stirring in your heart, or an unexpected confirmation. God's call isn't meant to be ignored. It's there to transform, to move us, and to awaken us to something greater. If God is igniting a burning bush in your life, don't ignore it. This might be the moment you've been waiting for so long. Moses always knew there was something greater for him, yet when the moment arrived, he wanted to run away. He even questioned, "Lord, who am I to speak with Pharaoh?" How many times have we convinced ourselves that we are too small for a purpose that is too big? Moses felt that weight. He had failed in the past and believed it prevented him from trying again. And how often, when facing a new job, a big challenge, or a daunting change, does that same doubt creep in? When that moment comes, we have two choices: run away or take the first step that could change everything. God answered him, "I will be with you." Many times, God gives us a sign, yet we still hesitate. Moses needed something more. He didn't see himself as a leader. Inner transformation doesn't happen in an instant. God didn't remove Moses' fear. The fear was still there. Instead, He asked Moses to face it. Then God said, "Take the snake by its tail." Moses took a deep breath, extended his hand, and touched the snake. In the blink of an eye, it turned back into a staff. What had always been in his hand transformed into a divine tool. God was showing him that what he already possessed was enough. He always demonstrates that what we already have is exactly what we need to begin. God did what He always does with those He chooses. He used what Moses already had. Yet Moses still hesitated. He wasn't convinced. Fear spoke louder. What if they don't believe in me? What if I don't know what to say? We often think we need something more. More talent, more courage, more preparation. The truth is, we'll never be completely ready. There will always be challenges along the way. The question is, are you ready to start with what you have, always trusting in God? Moses persisted, saying, "Lord, I'm not good with words. Please, Lord, send someone else." Have you noticed how, when fear takes over, we come up with more and more excuses? How we convince ourselves that someone else might do a better job than we do. Here was a man chosen by God, yet in the face of his call, all he saw was his own weakness. Moses' final barrier wasn't external. It was internal. He believed he wasn't eloquent, that his words wouldn't convince anyone. He saw himself as weak, imperfect. Then God answered him, "Who gave man a mouth? Who makes him speak or remain silent? Who gives him sight or makes him blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Go, and I will be with your mouth." But Moses was still afraid and wanted to run away. Then, in His mercy, God provided Moses with an ally, his brother Aaron, who would speak on his behalf. Yet the call was still Moses'. The mission was his. In truth, Aaron's presence wasn't just to ease Moses' insecurity, but also to teach him. Moses had grown up in the Egyptian palace, far from the culture and customs of the Hebrews. Aaron, on the other hand, knew the people, their traditions and their language. He would serve not only as a spokesperson but also as a mentor, helping Moses connect with those he was meant to lead. When God calls us to something great, He doesn't leave us alone. He places people by our side to strengthen, teach, and encourage us. Often, we feel we're not enough, but God makes up for our shortcomings through strategic relationships. He sends mentors, friends, spiritual leaders, and companions on our journey to help us grow in what we were called to do. Over time, Moses not only came to trust God more, but also developed his leadership abilities. While at first he needed Aaron to speak for him, later we see Moses leading the people with authority and conviction. He learned to communicate with the Hebrews, understood their pains and needs, and became the leader God always knew he could be. God does not require perfection, only willingness. He chooses those who are willing and transforms them throughout the journey. Moses didn't feel capable, but God already knew he was. Moses wasn't eloquent, yet God gave him words. He didn't know his people well, but God placed Aaron by his side. He didn't see himself as capable, yet God granted him authority. If you feel that you are not enough for the mission God has for you, remember, Moses felt the same way. So when faced with God's call for your life, the question shouldn't be, am I capable? But rather, am I willing to trust Him? Moses accepts the call. He returns to Egypt, the very place he once fled, and now comes back as a man chosen by God. Egypt would never be the same again. Now began the most difficult part, facing the impossible. Moses was about to confront and challenge the most powerful man in the world. With a firm voice, he declared to Pharaoh, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Silence filled the throne room. No man dared speak to Pharaoh in that manner. Yet Moses stood there as the ambassador of the living God. Still, Pharaoh laughed. Pharaoh retorted, "Who is this God that I should obey him? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." That was the first obstacle, the first barrier. Not only did Pharaoh refuse, he increased the Hebrews' workload. If their burden was heavy before, it now became unbearable. The very people Moses had come to free began to despise him. For Moses, this meant that things would only get worse before they could improve. He had to face the world's resistance. The journey is never easy, and indeed, things grew even worse before they began to get better. The Hebrews even questioned Moses, "Is this why you came? To make us suffer even more?" For the first time since accepting his mission, Moses doubted. He had done everything right, and yet everything went wrong. How many times have you tried to change something in your life, only for it to get worse at first? How many times did you take a step in the right direction, only to find the path growing more difficult? Moses asked, "Lord, why did you allow this? Why send me if things only got worse?" What Moses didn't yet understand was that every great purpose requires immense resistance. Nothing worth having comes without a struggle. God had never promised an easy road. He had promised to be with him. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Not only will he let the people go, but he will also drive them out of Egypt." And so, the plagues began. It was not merely a political battle. It was a spiritual war. The very God of the universe entered the fray, and one by one, Egypt's false gods were exposed for what they were. With each plague, Pharaoh's heart grew even harder. He had considered himself a god, but now he saw he was losing control over everything. God was toppling each of Egypt's false gods, demonstrating that he, and only he, was the true Lord. Moses was being molded by God. His purpose was to liberate, restore, and lead the people to the promised land. Though humble and reluctant to see himself as a leader, God saw the potential in him and sustained his calling. Pharaoh, on the other hand, had a purpose too, but it was driven by something entirely different. His mission was to keep Egypt strong, powerful, and untouchable. Seeing Moses challenge him, Pharaoh did not view it as an opportunity to do what was right. He saw it as an attack on his very authority. His hardened heart was fueled not only by pride, but also by the fear of appearing weak. And that is how many of us live. We cling to the past, to what we were taught, to what the world expects of us. And we don't realize that these very things can imprison us. Pharaoh wasn't just fighting Moses. He was fighting himself. He believed that keeping the Hebrews enslaved was essential to maintaining a prosperous Egypt. His power depended on oppressing others. But a purpose that must trample on others to survive is doomed to fail, because what God does not sustain, sooner or later crumbles. Moses and Pharaoh stood before the same truth. Only one of them chose to surrender to God. Never forget, purpose is not meant to impress others, but to transform your life and positively impact those around you. When you walk in God's purpose, you are part of a plan that is sure to be fulfilled. There was still one final plague, the most terrible of all, the death of the firstborn. That night marked the final stroke. The very God passed through Egypt, and every Egyptian firstborn died. Wailing echoed throughout the land until, at last, Pharaoh relented. The defeated Pharaoh said, "Take your people and leave Egypt." After generations of slavery, they were finally free. But freedom often comes with its own challenges. Moses knew the journey was far from over. Egypt was behind them, yet the greatest test still lay ahead. Pharaoh shouted, "What have we done? We let our slaves go. Prepare the war chariots. We're going to bring them back." The enemy never gives up without a fight. What seemed like a complete victory would soon turn into a moment of despair, for now the world's mightiest army was in pursuit. More than just a leader with his chariots, Pharaoh represented a spiritual barrier, something invisible, powerful, and real. He embodied a system that feeds on slavery. Whenever someone dares to break free from the chains, this system reacts forcefully, trying to stop the transformation and keep man trapped in a life of misery, devoid of purpose and salvation. The Hebrews heard it first, a distant sound, like thunder rolling over the land. Then they saw it, the Egyptian army advancing toward them. Trained warriors, armored chariots, sharp spears. They were coming, and they showed no mercy. Have you ever felt that way? When everything seems lost, when there appears to be no way out, when the past haunts you and a successful future seems impossible. That's exactly how the people felt at that moment. Fear, despair, frustration. And then, in that instant, the impossible happened. What seemed like an insurmountable obstacle became a pathway to salvation. God did not remove the sea. Instead, He opened a path through it, just as He does in our lives. The Hebrews did not have to fight. They only needed to believe and march. And that remains true today. We constantly search for solutions in all the wrong places, like sinking in quicksand. The true path isn't a method or a strategy. It's a person, Jesus Christ. Even the best plan fails without faith. This isn't just an option. It's the only truth. It is the only path, the only way, to the Father, to life, to salvation, to true freedom, and to everything else. All you need to do is take a step of faith. He will open a way where there seems to be no exit. And everything that appears to be the end might actually be your new beginning. Moses faced the impossible, and he prevailed. But his journey wasn't over yet. The greatest challenge wasn't just escaping slavery, but learning how to live in freedom. The people longed to be free, yet they didn't know how to live without a master guiding them. They had left slavery behind, but slavery still clung to them. Every difficulty was a reason to complain. In Egypt we had bread. Now we're here to die in the desert. The attitude of the Hebrews teaches us a profound lesson. Too often, we choose comfort over facing the necessary processes to achieve the life we desire. God provided water from a rock, quail, and manna, a mysterious food that fell from the sky daily to sustain the people in the desert. Still, they focused on what they lacked. This shows us that the problem isn't the absence of opportunities, but the inability to recognize and seize them. It's not about waiting for ideal conditions, but about making the best of what we have right now. The Hebrew people didn't take the necessary responsibility to get where they wanted to be. Everything demands sacrifice, and their constant complaints delayed their entry into the Promised Land. Our greatest enemy isn't out there. It's within us. If we don't change internally, our external lives won't change either. Moses sent 12 spies to scout out the promised land before the Hebrews entered it. For 40 days, they observed Canaan, its fertility, and its inhabitants. When they returned, they brought proof of the land's abundance, including a cluster of grapes so large it had to be carried by 2 men. However, only Joshua and Caleb saw the opportunity. The other 10 spies gave a pessimistic report, fearing giants and declaring the conquest impossible. But Joshua and Caleb trusted that God would grant them victory. And it remains that way today. Some see only the giants on the path. Others see the promised land. The people's lack of faith in the face of that negative report resulted in a great consequence. God decreed that that generation would not enter the promised land. Often, we blame God, but in truth, it is us who delay the fulfillment of our own purpose. The people were stuck in the desert, a time of trial marked by countless obstacles, from the scarcity of water and food to physical and emotional hardships. Yet it was also a period of overcoming, as the people persevered and learned fundamental lessons about faith and resilience. Before Moses died, God commanded him to appoint Joshua as his successor. And Caleb, a faithful warrior, bravely faced a territory inhabited by giants and conquered it with determination. This teaches us that not everyone who begins a journey reaches the destination. Only those who persevere, trust, and remain steadfast in faith are honored in due time. Moses did not enter the promised land. He, like the people, had his moment of weakness. When the Hebrews complained about the lack of water, God commanded Moses to speak to the rock. But in his frustration, Moses struck the rock twice with his staff. In that moment, he diverted God's glory to himself. Instead of saying, "God will provide," Moses declared, "Shall we bring water out of this rock for you?" With that, he seemed to attribute to himself, and to Aaron, a power that belongs only to God, for only he can make water flow from a rock. No man can claim the glory that belongs to the Lord, for it is he who, by his grace, grants us everything we have. God did not allow Moses to enter the promised land. From the top of Mount Nebo, he saw it from afar, but he died before setting foot in it. Leadership passed to Joshua. Moses' mission was fulfilled, but even he had to learn that everything comes from God. Moses lived for a greater purpose and left an eternal legacy. His epic journey echoes to this day. His story wasn't just about liberation, but about transformation. His transformation and ours. In the end, we are all called to a journey. But only those who decide to trust God and take the first step will discover how far that path can lead. The only question that remains is, do you have the courage to say yes? Now, let me ask you, what is the sea that lies before you? What do you fear that seems impossible to cross? Perhaps you think you aren't strong enough, that you lack the talent, or that you don't even know where to start. But remember, Moses thought the same. And God said to him, and what he says to you now, "I will be with you." If this story inspired you, give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more epic Bible stories. Comment below. What is the greatest lesson you learned from Moses' journey?